in views for it. I taught at Tyndale University for 10 years. One of the young women in our congregation did her undergraduate and her master's degree there, and she's appalled at how many of the academics there don't accept the Genesis account. So it permeates the Christian community. And this is one of the reasons why we are constantly going out to churches and communicating to people, because we need to get this message out, because it's just tearing the church up. So when the church follows the world, what happens? People leave the church, and it's primarily young people. So here's an example, and we have quite a few examples in our pool of materials that we have available of studies that have been done, why young people leave the church. And this chaplain at the university, he basically indicates that when the students come in, they make a profession that they believe in God, and I wouldn't word it exactly as he's worded it, because I would add, they say they believe in God, and then by their second year, it just dropped from, 80% down to 15%. So what's happening here? They may have gone to Christian schools, they may have been homeschooled, they hit the university, and they don't have the legs to stand on when they're taught evolutionary anthropology, evolutionary sociology, evolutionary biology. They don't have the legs. And so the faculties just pummel them. That's what happens. So, the primary reason that is given by young people is they start to believe in evolution. That's the primary reason that they're leaving the church. There are other reasons, but that's the primary answer that's given. And so, these are the kinds of questions, I'm not going to read these, but these are the kinds of questions that we need to be able to address. And when I say we, I mean all of us, because we have family members, we have grandchildren, we have children, we teach Sunday schools, all of these things. We need to be able to turn so that we can not lose our generations of young people because of the onslaught of evolution. And so how do we answer these kinds of questions? Well, even many of you may have doubts. I was in a church this morning, and a fellow was saying to me that he didn't really understand how I could, even though I'd presented, he couldn't understand how I could believe in six-day creation when the starlight is billions of years away. And I agree, starlight is billions of years away. And so how can we see stars when they're billions of years away? There are good answers to these, by the way. And so much of we are right up to date with science. We have a big pool of PhD scientists on our staff. Robert Carter is an example, John Sarfati, right? We have a whole spectrum of them, of PhD scientists. But we keep up to date on the science, and much of what I'm going to present right now is all of it's been within the past 20 years. In fact, much of it's within the past 10 years. In fact, I'm constantly updating and my presentations and my writing, because we keep finding more and more stuff that supports creation and is decimating evolution. And so if you have these questions, there are answers to them. So what I'd like to do is to consider some of the evidence, and I can only do it at a high level. I actually have 13 presentations, and if I were to give those to you, we'd be here until tomorrow, literally. So I can only cover it at a high level right now, so you have to appreciate that. We're going to just do a high-level sweep, and I'm happy to go into more detail during the question and answers. But before we do that, I have used the word evolution, so I need to define it. And so that you don't think I'm creating a straw man definition, after I define it, I will quote to you an evolutionist definition, just to indicate that. So, evolutionists claim that all of life started from an original cell that somehow came into existence. Okay? Let's just assume that for the moment the chemical evolution has occurred and we've gotten to the point of a living cell. From that, genetic information has been increasing through time for approximately 1 billion years since the first cell is supposed to have come on the scene, and genetic information has been increasing. So if you take the simplest bacteria, single-celled entity, the simplest one that has all the functions of being able to reproduce, and it has about 480 genes in it. Humans have roughly 30,000 genes. So the idea is that over time, genetic information has been increasing in the complexity of life. So keep that in mind. Information is increasing. Then, the next thing we have to say is that the species are all the little leaves at the very top, and that's what we see today. But some species have died out. Some are found only in the fossil record. Others have died out since the fossils were formed. Saber-toothed cats, mastodons, woolly mammoths, so on. They died out during and after the Ice Age. And then there are the branches in which there are missing links. And I don't invent that term. Evolutionists use the term missing links. And so they admit it. And periodically you'll see in the popular media, missing link has been found. If you watch the scientific literature, you'll see after a while it fades out and it's classified as this or that, and it's no longer a missing link. That's where we're at. In fact, one prominent, actually I quoted Stephen Jay Gould, he realized and admitted that the missing links are there, and he came up with a way to get around it because we don't observe evolution. He calls it punctuated equilibria. And the idea is that evolution occurs so quickly that it never makes it into the fossil record. So you can have evolution without demonstrating it. That's how he got around it, punctuated equilibria. So here's Lynn Margulis. She's no longer alive, but she was a prominent evolutionist, and she says this: every form of life on Earth, every form of life, oak tree, so there's plants, elephant, animals, birds, and bacterium. Now, she doesn't list humans, but she says every form of life, so presumably that includes human, shares a common ancestry with every other form. And then she goes on to say that this is a fact and so on, because evolutionists like to say it's a fact. But that definition, remember this, from a single cell, increasing complexity. This is not evolution. The canine kind that God created include wolves and foxes and coyotes and so on, and it included domestic dogs in their original gene. It was all there, and there has been specialization going on into niches. We call it natural selection, yes, and there's been human specialization in the breeding of dogs for 3,000 years, but over that 3,000 years, they are still dogs. But the interesting thing is, if you take any of those specialized breeds, they are not as robust as a mutt which has a lot of genetic mixing. I had a friend who raised Great Danes, and Great Danes don't last very long. They have a heart condition. And a cousin of my wife raised Dalmatians, and in every third generation he would breed husky and to strengthen the line, because over time they would deteriorate. And so this is not evolution. This is losing genetic robustness and losing information capacity. And here is when I mentioned Robert Carter. So I have this, and an article will be appearing probably in the next issue of Creation magazine. If not, it'll be the next one. I don't know when they've typeset it. So I wrote on this T, and then Robert became my co-author because he nerded it up, he said. He nerded it up. So all the technical names for the species, and he put that in the article. So if you get Creation magazine and you see the T article, it's me and Robert that wrote it, okay? So there's a plant that's been found in China that is caffeine-free. It's a natural black tea, a standard tea, like orange pico type of tea, and it's caffeine-free. And I believe that this could eventually become a bestseller, because do you know what it takes to produce decaffeinated tea and decaffeinated coffee? You probably wouldn't want to drink them if you knew what it took to do it. And I do describe that a bit in the article in terms of what it takes. Why do plants have caffeine? Anybody know? Anybody want to venture a guess? Caffeine is a pesticide. Caffeine is a poison. Caffeine poisons caterpillars and keeps them away from tea. Now, I had 2 cups of tea today, and they were caffeinated tea. And you probably did tea or coffee as well, right? So, in limited quantities, we can tolerate the poison. But you know what happens when you have high caffeine drinks. It messes up your metabolism. And you could kill yourself if you took too much caffeine. But it's no different. You know, we can metabolize chocolate, but dogs can't. There's enzymes in there that they have trouble with. And if you eat too much chocolate, you will poison yourself. If you eat too much licorice, you'll poison yourself. Black licorice, and so on. So some foods that we eat actually have poisons in them, and caffeine is one of them. So the economists writing on this, they said on closer inspection of this plant, and they were looking at the genetic information, they discovered that the caffeine-free version has lost the ability to create an enzyme called caffeine synthase. Now, that enzyme appears in coffee as well. It appears in cocoa, chocolate, the source of that. That same enzyme appears in quite a few places, but it has lost the ability to manufacture that enzyme, and that plant, unless humans protect it, is going to not be as robust, and it's going to be attacked by caterpillars. And so we would have to protect it by using other pesticides or putting it in a greenhouse or any number of things to keep that plant. Now notice what the article says. It's made its evolutionary journey towards losing caffeine. This is a bait and switch. This isn't evolution. This is a loss of genetic information. It's a loss of robustness. And yet, you've got to watch this because they use it all the time. They plow this word evolution into it, and it's not evolution. It's devolution. It's removing information. It's decay. We declare emphatically, as God says when He's introducing the 10 Commandments, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and He rested on the 7th day. God says He created in 6 days. We declare that that is 6 natural days, 6 consecutive days, what we would call 24-hour days, and God created the entire universe and the world 6,000 years ago. At that point, most people's heads explode. Do you really believe that God created in 6,000 years? Emphatically, I do, yes. Dawkins, by the way, calls me ignorant because I believe that. Okay, so keep that 6,000 in mind. It becomes significant later. So I want to just sweep through 5 reasons why we should accept that God created in 6 natural days and 6,000 years ago. First, I want to present to you that Genesis 1 account is history. Second, we have to deal with the fact that Adam introduced death, and that has a profound importance for our whole view of creation. Thirdly, it's difficult to explain things from an evolutionary perspective that we see around us. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. I have a whole presentation, in fact, 2 presentations, where I deal with evolution in a lot more detail. So I can only be very high level today. Thirdly, I just want to sweep through a few examples where I deal only with the earth not being billions of years old. I have a separate long presentation dealing with it, and also one on the age of the universe. And then I just want to deal with a few facts to support the Genesis flood. Okay? So we're just going to sweep through those. Appreciate that has to be high level tonight. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to avoid giving you the evidence. We just don't have time for it all. On the left-hand side, we have the evolutionary sequence. If you read a book like The Brief History of Time from Stephen Hawking and Carl Sagan's introduction there. Both of them say, in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple. And out of that, the Big Bang. Now, just put your thinking hat on for a moment. There was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple, and then there was a Big Bang. So, and from that sequence, this is the evolutionary sequence, the life event, the planets form, the solar systems form, the planets form, life starts to evolve, and single cell, and then complex creatures. And you've probably seen the cartoons with fish trying to crawl out onto the water, deciding whether they want to evolve, right? You've seen those kinds of cartoons. And then eventually you get the primates and the hominoids, and then man comes on the scene. That's the evolutionary sequence. On the right, you just read Genesis 1. It's the order in which it appears in Genesis 1. Those two sequences cannot be rationalized. They cannot be synchronized. So there's a basic law of logic called the Law of Non-Contradiction. And the Law of Non-Contradiction says, if you have two things that are contrary to one another, at least one of them must be incorrect. Both could be incorrect, but one of them must be incorrect. So I'm going to propose to you tonight that at least one of these is incorrect. You probably have already guessed which one. But at least one of them. So let's look at Genesis account and determine whether we should take it as history. There are all kinds of attempts that have been made within the evangelical academic community to try to rationalize this. And I'm one of my presentations, I list probably 8 or 10 attempts to rationalize this. The gap theory, the framework hypothesis, and all these different things. Let's just take one example tonight. People said that Genesis 1 is poetry. Let's just take that as an example. So, the natural reading of the text is not poetry. You know what poetry looks like. It's not. And Stephen Boyd, who is a Hebrew scholar, and by the way, I just take a digression here. My father did his doctoral work in Hebrew Semitic studies, and his PhD dissertation was on Hebrew verbs. I learned my Hebrew from my dad, and we used to discuss this point about verbs. And my dad was an expert in Hebrew verbs. So I understand what's being said here. He says that when you have the verbs in narrative text, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the verb forms are different than the verb forms that you have in poetry, like in the book of Psalms. If I can give you an illustration on how this works. We used to have, like I grew up as a kid using the King James Version. Remember there were words like ye and thee and thou and those kinds of things? And that was considered to be formal language. In fact, people were mistaken. In the day of 1611, that was the common language, and actually you was the formal. But the formal is replaced. So, but you see the difference between the concept of casual and formal. Well, it's similar to what's going on here. The verb forms that are used in the poetic are different than the verb forms that are used in narrative. And Stephen Boyd did the statistical analysis, and I love it because I taught statistics for 10 years, but he says that it's beyond any measure of statistical significance because it's overwhelmingly narrative verb forms in Genesis 1. There's no poetic verb forms there. It's a majestic piece of text, no question about it, but it's not written in poetry form. And we then have Genesis 1 is presented as a chronology in a historical context. And when Moses assembled the book of Genesis, he just continued going right on. Why is Genesis 1 not history, but Genesis 12 is history? Well, of course, some people don't believe that Abraham is even historical. But where do we start picking up history versus, well, according to Moses, it's all history. And we read that God created in 6 days to set a pattern for the week. think about this. Where did a 7-day week come from? You read articles in the secular media. There was a number of years ago, The Economist tried to propose how 7-day week came into existence in their Christmas edition. And it just made me laugh, because they said it came out of Sumeria, and they said that they mapped the days of the week to the sun, moon, and stars and so on. But the stupidity of that argument is that there were more than 7 objects in the Sumerian pantheon. Just count them. You have sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Earth. There's more than 7. And so it's the other way around. The Sumerians mapped the objects to the days a 7-day week. Because where did the 7-day week come from? From creation. And the interesting thing is, at various points in history, men have attempted to get rid of the 7-day week. During the French Revolution and in China under Mao, they tried to get rid of it. And what happened? They had to get rid of their 10-day weeks. People couldn't do it. They need a day of rest. God knew what he was doing, so he sets a pattern for the week. Everywhere in the world, every culture, they all have a 7-day week. Just because it goes right back to creation. We also have something in the Genesis account which has a technical name to it, but in English it's and, basically and. And God did this, and God said this. And this structure in narrative is to give you the idea that it's a quick and rapid sequence. I'll tell you a little anecdote on this. When I was in high school, in an English class, I was writing essays, and I started sentences with and. And my teacher says, we don't start sentences with and. But in those days, Bibles were in the classrooms, and I opened it up and showed, and it was King James at that time, and I showed her the book of Revelation. Almost every sentence begins with and. So I'm exaggerating a bit. So we don't now, in modern translations, we use now and other things but the and. But that is giving sequential events. That is what it's representing. Temporal, historical events. And then we have the use of the ordinal. Now, first day, second day. Day 1 is not an ordinal. It says first day. That's not an ordinal. Second, third, fourth is an ordinal. But it doesn't matter. When you look at the ordinals used in Numbers 7 and 29, when the sacrifices are being presented, there isn't a theologian on earth who would tell you that those aren't natural days. And yet they try to impose on Genesis 1 and say, oh, those aren't natural days. They're reading into the text. They're not reading out of the text. We then have, every day is declared to have an evening and a morning. Now, we use Roman reckoning, and we say morning and evening. There's nothing sacred about that because the Romans invented that reckoning. But evening and morning. Now, think about this. How else could God communicate that these are natural days? Could he have said 24 hours? No, that's an artifact post-flood. Some say it came from Samaria, some from Babylon, some from Egypt. They don't know where it came from. Why 24 hours? In fact, it's kind of silly, isn't it? We have to say AM and PM and keep track of it. The Swiss watch company on their website is proposing we move to metric time. They're proposing we use a 10-hour day, 100 minutes in an hour, 100 seconds in an hour. Makes good sense. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, why is it any worse than 24 or any better? Well, how else could God communicate to us than saying each day had an evening and a morning? And that doesn't depend on the presence of the sun on day 4, because on day 1, the earth was already there, and it was spinning, and God generated light from himself, and there was evening and there was morning already. So it doesn't depend on sun and moon, which were created on day 4. And then we have, in the 10 Commandments, God sets an analogy. He says, I created in 6 days and rested on the 7th, therefore you will do it. If that analogy totally falls apart if he didn't do that. And then we have Jesus saying that at the beginning he created them male and female, not 13 billion years after the beginning. Now, one person came to me in the question and said, well, no, he didn't create Adam and Eve at the beginning. He created them on day 6. True, but not 13.8 billion. And he tells us it was day 6, right? So, the rest of the Bible treats Genesis 1 as history. Just take a few examples. In Hebrews 11:3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By the way, this is a really good reference for theistic evolution, because it says the things that were not made out of other things that were already in existence. Now, granted, God did use dust to create the body of Adam, and then he breathed life into it. But again, he tells us what he did. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he sets up using natural light as an analogy for spiritual light. So he's accepting that God did this as an analogy for spiritual light. I don't know how else God could have communicated more clearly than he does that these were 6 natural days consecutive to one another than what he has done in Genesis 1. In fact, one prominent Hebrew scholar, by no means an evangelical Christian, he says, probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 to 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the 24-hour days that we have. Now, he did not believe that God had created in 6 24-hour days, but he said that's what the writers intended to communicate. Just quickly on this issue with regard to death. And we at CMR are constantly fighting this particular battle. It comes up all the time. And the issue here is that death was introduced by Adam. And it was death of living creatures, which in Hebrew is the term is nefesh kaya. It's used to describe land-based creatures, and probably also applies to birds, and it applies to humans, living creatures or living creature in the singular when it was with Adam. So in Genesis 1:31, after the creation of Adam, God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. And what we find, though, is in the fossil record, there is evidence of carnivorism and decay and cancer and rickets and, of course, death. Lots of it. And so if all these fossils were created before Adam died, then we have, and God declares this to be very good, then I don't understand what the definition of the word good means, plain and simply. Even if you were to buy into the concept that, which many Christians are trying to propose right now, that when God said, eat of this fruit, dying you shall die, that he wasn't referring to animal death, but even so, millions and millions of years of animal death, I don't care what you say, it's not very good. So they're arguing, well, animals don't experience pain and all kinds of things. So this is not the case. And Adam brought the curse not only on himself, and Eve, of course, was cursed, but not only on them, but the curse was brought on the created order, thistles and thorns, and animal death of the nefesh kaya. And so every single fossil must have been formed after Adam sinned and introduced death. It had to be. Now, we're grappling with this issue because people then say, well, Adam and the animals were told to eat plants. Don't plants die? So I wrote an article dealing with this in which I argued basically that plants are robots. They're organic robots. And we're working on an episode of Creation Magazine Live in which we're going to present and deal with this subject in Season 9. The first 2 episodes in Season 9 are coming out are going to deal with
global warming, supposed global warming, from the CMI perspective, and it's 2 episodes. But we're coming. Richard asked me to put an episode together, write the script for dealing with death. So we're going to try to deal with this and nail it down. With did I pull the? Can you still hear me? Okay, I hit the cord there, came out. So we have this situation. If we don't have a historical Adam, if we do not have the fall of Adam that brought death into the world, then we really don't have a historical Christ, and we don't have the solution to death, because Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that it was Christ's resurrection that conquered the final enemy, death, right? So it's absolutely fundamental that we understand that the historical Adam who introduced death not only for humans but also for animals, nefesh kaya. And Paul makes this clear. He says, for as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. Paul is assuming a historical Adam there, and all those whom Adam represented as a covenant mediator for all of mankind as the covenant head die because of Adam's sin. But all those who are represented under the new covenant by Christ, all those whom Christ represent, live. And the analogy falls apart if there's no historical Adam. And plain and simply, if there's no historical Adam to introduce death, you have no historical Christ that has a solution to death. Fundamental. So I want to just sweep through some examples of how difficult it is for evolutionists to explain these things. I'm not going to start with prebiotic chemical evolution, although I spend time on that in other presentations. So let's just assume that we've gotten to the point of basically biological evolution. And where we need to start is with DNA. And scientists have attempted for 70 years now, since DNA was decoded in the 1950s, they've attempted to come up with the building blocks and to build DNA. So one example is this study that was done by Stanley Miller, and the Scientific American at the time reported that all he did was produce tar. Notice here, scientists have uncovered life's missing link. You see, they use the term missing link. And they're saying this new experiment is solving the problem of how DNA is coming to existence. Baloney, but that's what they're claiming. And a project spent 10 years and a huge amount of money trying to come up with artificial life. And the project is called Synthia, but it's spelled with an S, synthesizing life. And you can read about it in a book called The Stairway to Life. And it was published last year. We do carry the book. It isn't necessarily a creationist book. It's a detailed analysis of what's called the idea that life can just come into existence out of nothing. That's what it is. I highly recommend it. I read it last year, right after it had come out, on my flight to Edmonton, and I was rereading it on my flight to Edmonton again, because I flew into Edmonton and then down to Calgary. So I'm rereading it a second time. It is mind-blowing in terms of blowing. It's impossible that the chemicals can form life. So let's look at this, though. If you know anything about DNA, let's just try to assemble some DNA. So we start off, and there are basically 4 letters that are used to make DNA. And these letters are called nucleotides. And each nucleotide, if you're interested, is made up of a phosphate group, a sugar, usually ribose, but there's another one, and a nitrogen group. And the variation in the nitrogen group is what makes the 4 letters. So picture these letters. There are 4 of them, and they're like beads, 4 colored beads. And you're going to slide them onto a string, okay? For the human genome, there are 3 billion beads that you're going to have to put on the string. As you assemble them, you're going to make words out of those letters, and then you're going to make sentences, and you're going to make paragraphs. So now what we have, when we get to the paragraph, is basically a gene. And in between are other paragraphs that are regulatory DNA. A few years ago, people called this junk DNA. In the past 10 years, they've discovered so much about DNA, they no longer refer to this as junk DNA. It's regulatory DNA, all kinds of information for how to manufacture genes. So we assembled paragraphs into genes and regulatory DNA, and we're interspersing it as we're feeding all these beads on. You with me so far? As we're building up this chain of beads. Now, we have a collection of these paragraphs, and we put them into a chapter. These are the chromosomes. And in the human chromosomes, there are 46 of them in the human genome, and those are the chapters, and the whole thing together is the book of life, DNA. There are 30,000 genes in the human genome in total. Now, the problem isn't, although it is a problem, and that book, The Stairway to Life, indicates that it is, the problem isn't getting the nucleotides, assembling those three-part alphabetic characters. The problem is putting the beads in an order that makes sense, that there's information. It's not the hardware that's the problem. It's the software that's the problem. And so even if you could get the hardware spontaneously, you've got to get all that information in DNA. And Paul Davies, a physicist, he said this: how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell, because that does all the processing of DNA and RNA and manufacturing the proteins and so on? How did it do this from blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? So I will make you a wager, which I know I'm not going to lose. I will give any one of you $1 million if you can bring to me and show me that your cell phone or your computer wrote its own app. We know it's not going to happen. And yet the evolutionists put on their blinders and they say blind random chance molecules floating around have assembled themselves into 3 billion letters. Not a chance. When we look at DNA, it is mind-boggling what's been discovered in the past decade about DNA. Just think about this. Does anybody know what a palindrome is? So Adam voiced the very first palindrome when he came up and he said, "Madam, I'm Adam." It can be read in both directions. Napoleon had a palindrome. He says, "Able was I ere I saw Elba." You can read it in both directions. Do you know that DNA, 3 billion characters, can be read in both directions? Do you know that DNA can be triggered by various events in the regulatory, and different genes work together depending on what regulatory signals are put out? Skin color, for example, is regulated by at least 2 separate genes, completely separated, and it may be more. There's also in the structure of DNA, there's something called epigenetic signals coming in from outside of the cell that trigger events in developing embryos. And I'll give you a concrete example. When a woman in a high-altitude environment, who lives in a high-altitude environment, like the Andes or in the Himalayas, an embryo is developing within her, the epigenetic signals indicate atmospheric pressure, and they trigger the development of, it's already built into the genes, but they trigger events, and that child is born with larger lung capacity. That is information encoded in the human genome that can be triggered by information not inside the gene, but coming from the environment and triggering that. That's incredible. And there's all kinds of this, triggers and switches, and as we will see, it gets even more so. If there's anything that declares made by God, it is DNA. Let's take it up a level, though. Our cells have nucleuses, and then there's the nuclear DNA. There's another set of DNA, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the nuclear DNA is inside a nucleus. How did cells get a nucleus? There's a theory called cell capture, that one cell captured another in order to create a nucleus, but it's all basically fairy tales. But let's take it up a little further. How did multicellular entities come into existence? Cells talk to one another. I'll give you an example. If you cut yourself and you get a bleed, what happens? It begins to coagulate. Thankfully, God has designed our system that our bodies just don't completely coagulate. There's all kinds of regulation going in there, but it knows when it needs to coagulate. So what happens is it finally is coagulated, so then the blood cells have to communicate with the skin cells, and they have to say, okay, I've solved the bleeding problem, now let's start rebuilding the skin and sealing the wound. Cells are talking to one another, literally. They do that through chemical and electrical signals. They literally talk to one another. When an embryo is developing, the cells start communicating. They say, oh, by the way, I need a liver cell over here. I need a skin cell over here. I need a hair cell over here. Cells talk to one another. How did they learn to do that, to work together? Let's take it up a level. If you looked at, if you remember your high school science, amoebas would clone their chromosomes and then they would split. That's asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, though, two sets of chromosomes, one from the male and one from the female, come together. How did cells ever decide to have two sets of chromosomes to work together to create an entity and to decide when to use which set of chromosomes? And by the way, DNA's got all kinds of error correction algorithms in it, and if you've got a genetic defect in one set of chromosomes, the other set will be used. Not always, but it will override. And so God has built in amazing capabilities into DNA. But let's just think about this. Even if a male entity with the male plumbing were to come into existence at a point in time in a place, purely by chance, at exactly the same time, in the same place, there would have had to have been a female entity come into existence with the female plumbing, or it'll never work. I mean, the concept is that these two could have come into existence simultaneously at once is mind-boggling. Let's take it up a level. Darwin said in his book on the origin of species, he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, I want you to realize something. When Darwin published in the 1850s, he knew nothing about DNA. It occurred 100 years later that Watson and Crick were starting to decode DNA. And much of what we know about DNA has only been discovered in the past 10 years, which is 160 years, right? Well, anyway, it's a long time since Darwin wrote. Yeah, 160 years. So, Darwin knew nothing about DNA. He knew nothing about genetics because Mendel was working on his pea experiments right at that time. Mendel published his first papers on genetics about 4 to 5 years after Darwin published, and nobody paid any attention to Mendel's genetics until about 1900. Darwin knew nothing about DNA, he knew nothing about genetics, and he knew nothing about the complexity of cells. To his mind, a cell was just an amorphous mass of protoplasm. We now know that cells are mind-bogglingly complex. They are factories. They have waste disposal. They have energy production. They have transportation mechanism. They have manufacturing facilities. They are more complex than any machine that humans have put together to date. A single cell. Darwin knew nothing about the complexity of cells. I won't go into the complexity of cells, but the machines that are in cells cannot have been assembled by slight modifications. The whole machine has to be there or it doesn't work. But just take at a higher level for our discussion today, these are various examples where it falls apart. If you know any, in theory, reptiles evolved into birds, in theory. Well, there's a huge difference between scales and feathers. And take the eggs example. If you know anything about fish eggs, they're quite different than amphibian eggs, which tadpoles come from, which are quite different than reptilian eggs, which are quite different than bird eggs, which are very different than human eggs. How on earth does this sequence go through slight modifications? Bible has the answer. God created in a mature form. I want to take it up a level. Do any of you grow tomatoes? Yeah. How do tomatoes get pollinated? A little bit by wind. But if you have them in a greenhouse tomatoes, they won't get pollinated. You can hand pollinate them. That's a big job. You need bumblebees. Why bumblebees? Not standard bees. Why bumblebees? Well, because bumblebees are the only bee that hums while they work, and they hum at middle C. And when they hum at middle C, the flowers on tomatoes open up. They vibrate open at middle C, and they can be pollinated. Isn't that amazing? Now, I know that if I come back in a year, if I'm invited back after this, if I come back in a year, you'll have forgotten everything in this presentation. I guarantee you'll never forget the bumblebees. So, there are many examples of symbiotic relationships in nature that evolutionists just cannot explain. There are hundreds of them. They cannot explain because you need both parts there. In my more detailed presentation I do on evolution, I give many other examples of symbiotic relationships. I want to take it up one more level in this pass, and that's the origin of human language. According to evolutionists, languages develop from primitive grunts and groans, and they become more complex through time. That's the evolutionary theory. In fact, it's the other way around. Older languages are more complex than newer languages. English came out of two basic families at the time of the Norman Conquest under the Saxon languages like Germanic and Dutch and that kind of thing, and out of the Romance languages like French. But English is less complex. Of course, a person who's just learning English doesn't think it's less complex. But it is a less complex language. Just to give you one example, in English, we're losing the ability to separate who and whom. I suspect there are very few people who know when to use who versus whom, right? So languages are simplifying through time. You go back beyond French to Latin. It structurally is a more complex language than French. You go back beyond to an older language, which is Greek, and it is structurally more complex in the Indo-European family of language. You go back further beyond to Sanskrit, and it is an incredibly complex language. Languages are devolving. They're getting simpler through time. They're losing complexity, not as the evolutionists would claim. There's also been a common vocabulary decline. At the time of William Shakespeare, it is estimated that the average person knew 60,000 words. Today, the average person is estimated to know about 15,000 words, and the average teenager knows about 100. Sorry if I've offended any of you teenagers. After the Enlightenment, there were various attempts to find the proto-language, the original root language from which all languages developed. And they even talked about this root proto-language. They've given up on that. If you were to go to a linguistics program and say, I want to do a doctoral work on this, they won't even look at it. And today they talk about bushes of languages because they know that languages are fundamentally, structurally quite different. And what's interesting is, in the historical record around 2200 BC, suddenly a whole lot of language spring into existence. Akkadian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Chaldean, on and on and on. Well, we have the answer. Genesis 11, ridiculed by the world, but it tells us where these languages all originated. Human language confirms the biblical account. There's devolution, and all these languages suddenly appear in the historical record at the same time. I want to quickly give you some examples of the earth cannot be billions of years old. We have another part of our cell, which is called mitochondria. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. They basically, literally generate electricity for the cells to run the factories. in the cells. This is the Beck generating plant at Niagara Falls. And we primarily inherit, in fact, should probably say we inherit our mitochondrial DNA from our parents. Some people are proposing there may be some father influence, but it hasn't been proven. So I'm going to actually change that wording. We inherit our mitochondrial DNA from our mothers. The interesting thing is that we all have basically identical mitochondrial DNA. In our nuclear DNA, there's a lot of variation that comes as expresses in the phenome approach, so skin color, height, all kinds of things, body mass indexes, and so on. But in mitochondrial DNA, we are all, human population is about identical. And there's somewhere around 800 mutations worldwide in mitochondrial DNA, which is extremely low. Very few mutations in mitochondrial DNA because we're all essentially identical. So, some studies have been done on this mitochondrial DNA, and they've taken samples of, say, a hairbrush from a Russian princess that's in the museum. And we know she was before the Russian Revolution, and we know who her descendants are, and we take a DNA sample, and we compare the mitochondria DNA then and now. And the same thing was done with Civil War vets. So 150 years ago, the young man went away to war. The mother took a lock of hair, put it in an envelope, and we have it. And we compare it. We know whose descendants are. And we compare it, and we can calculate. Now, Ann Gibbons, writing about this, she said this: evolutionary studies led them to expect about one mutation in 600 generations, one every 12,000 years. So let's pause there for a second. Why would they assume that? Well, they assume that humans have been on the earth for 200,000 years. And if there are about 800 mutations, you can get a rough order of how often a mutation occurs. Do you follow that? If you've been around 200,000 years and you have roughly 800, divide the 200,000 years. But they were stunned, she says. Oops, I went too far. They were stunned to find 10 base pair changes, which gave them a rate of one mutation every 40 generations or one every 800 years. The problem is, as she states it, mitochondrial DNA change rate is too rapid. Because if humans have been around for 200,000 years, there should be a lot more change. Because if it's that rapid, then we should see many, many, many more mutations in mitochondrial DNA. Now, do you remember a number I said to you to hold in your head? What number? 6,000. Do you remember that? In this paper, and I can give you the reference to it if you want to go and look it up, Ann Gibbons says, measured rate indicates that mankind has only been in the earth for 6,000 years. Isn't that uncanny? And then she says, but nobody believes that. Another example why the world isn't as old as people say it is genome decay. And I have copies of Sanford's book out there, and get them while they're hot, because there are only 3 of them left here. Sanford's book called Genetic Entropy. Now, this is a professor at Cornell University, a geneticist. And by the way, he's one of our CMS speakers and writers and lecturers. He has 30 plus genetic patents. He's one of the world leading geneticists. And he's written this book in Genetic Entropy. And he says that mutations are accumulating in each generation, somewhere on the range of 200 to 300 mutations per generation, and they're staying in the genome. Now, so are there any children here? So when I have children in the audience, I say to the parents, you have mutants at your breakfast table. So what's happening here is these mutations. Now, many of the mutations are benign. They are single change in the nucleotides. That's the beads on the DNA string. And they're like a spelling mistake. You can read sentences and paragraphs even though they got lots of spelling mistakes. God designed DNA with all kinds of error correction, utilities, and DNA, and the regulatory DNA knows when there's a spelling mistake, and it will make corrections. Some of them are too grievous so that there is no correction. How many genetic diseases do you think there are right now in the human genome? Rough order of magnitude. It turns out it's around 6,000. 6,000 genetic diseases. Some of them you've heard of, like cystic fibrosis, right? One of them you may have never thought is a genetic disease, a mutation. It's called lactose intolerance. Some of you probably have that. And it's inherited, lactose intolerance. Now, there are also environmental lactose intolerance, but there's genetic lactose intolerance. And so the mutations are accumulating in each generation. And Sanford says that natural selection doesn't filter out the harmful mutations, and the benign mutations are basically ignored. And he says that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will be in destruct mode. Now, where are we in time? We're roughly 200 generations since Adam. We have another 100 generations to go. I personally believe that Christ is going to return before we have any collapse of the human race, because God made the promise in Genesis 9 that there's never going to be a complete wipeout of the human race, right? So Christ is going to return and renovate the world, the universe. So another evidence that the world cannot be billions of or millions of years old. Mary Schweitzer, writing in the Smithsonian, that's the magazine of the Smithsonian Institute and the museums in Washington, D.C., in 2006, she described having found soft tissue in dinosaur bones. When she published that, a lot of evolutionists became very upset because they said, well, there's no way that soft tissue can be in dinosaur bones that were buried 65 million years ago. It would have long ago, organic material decays. And so they accused her of having tainted samples and various things. Well, she kept at it, kept working, and has continued to publish various findings. In fact, in our database, we track all these types of studies. We have over 50 examples of soft tissue in dino bones and about 100 other articles in other kinds of bones of soft tissue. The only conceivable way that this soft tissue could have survived, if it's the last vestiges of the fossils that were buried during the flood and that it's still around, it can't be 65 million years old. So if the Earth was old as this, as they claim, there would be no soft tissue. And I was driving over from Olds, and I saw some of these monsters out there ducking up and down their heads. Oil pressure, and gas pressure in particular, would long ago have dissipated if it was buried in sedimentary rock millions of years ago. And we have one more example in this sweep, and this is magnetism of the Earth. The Earth has basically an electric current running around it, and when you have an electric current, I think it's the left-hand rule, if current's flowing this way, you create a magnet. And dynamos are used for that purpose, to create magnets. The Earth is a big, giant magnet. Now, some scientists will tell you that the magnetosphere protects the Earth from cosmic rays. The magnetosphere is also used by birds that navigate. They can actually sense the magnetism, and so they know what direction to fly. So there are various things that the magnetosphere has. But studies have been done where they've taken pottery that was formed, say, at 1000 AD, and they've used exactly the same techniques today to form similar pottery. When pottery is formed, the clay molecules take on a magnetic moment, and you can compare it to today. And they've calculated a 40% decline over a 1,000-year period of the Earth's magnetism. Now, Russell Humphreys, one of our physicists at CMI, when one of the first satellite probes went by the planets like Mercury, and they took the magnetism of Mercury, he predicted the decline that would occur in the magnetism in the planet Mercury. And if 20 or 30 years later, when another flyby went by, his prediction was right on. The magnetic field, not only of Earth, but of some of the moons that have magnetic field and planets that do, they're decaying rapidly. Rapidly. In 1,000 years, at this decay rate, the Earth will not have a magnetosphere. If you extrapolate it back at the decay rate to go back about 10,000 years, the Earth would have been so magnetic it would have been a molten mass. Plain and simply, the Earth cannot be this old because it still has magnetism. Now, how do evolutionists respond? They say, well, it must regenerate. Have you ever seen it regenerate? Do we have any empirical evidence that it regenerates? No. Well, why do you believe it? Because it must, because the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So they're letting their presupposition influence their interpretation of the data. So the Earth isn't really old. It's just tired. And that's what Paul tells us in Romans, that the whole creation is groaning, waiting for its redemption. So one last quick view. Let's just look at the facts to support the biblical account of the flood. Mass extinctions. Which way is west from here? This way? This way. You go 100 kilometers from here. What happened the last couple of weeks? Massive flooding. Were fossils being formed? This is a 500-year flood, one of the worst floods we've ever seen. Was fossils being formed? Did it do mass extinctions? And yet evolutionists will tell you that these little local floods created the fossil record. One of the worst floods we've ever seen. It's not creating mass extinctions. Worldwide sediment layers. You line up Brazil and Africa. The sediment layers go right across. They're consistent. Timothy Clary at the Institute for Creation Research last year put out an absolutely monumental book. He is a geologist, a PhD in geology, and he worked in the oil industry and had access to all of the core samples from around the world. And he has actually taken those core samples, the sediment layers, and he's able to describe how the sediment layers were laid down during the flood. It is incredible what he's done there. There is a sediment layer that basically runs from Kenora, Ontario, all the way out to the Rocky Mountains and down into the United States. There is no way that that sediment layer was formed by a delta of a river. These sediment layers were laid down in the flood, and unfortunately my copies are all sold out. I had them with me, but if you want a fantastic book, it's by Michael Ord, one of our scientists, and it's called How the Flood Shaped Our Earth. It is really, really good, and it explains this, and he explains how this would have happened. The Grand Canyon wasn't formed by the Colorado River. It is impossible, even with a 500-year flood, that these massive boulders, the soft sediment layers laid down during the flood, as the water was rushing into as the continents were shifting and tectonic and new ocean basins were being formed, the sediment was still soft and it was eroded massively, and then the Colorado River follows the path of least resistance. Mount St. Helens gives us a little microcosm of this. When it exploded in 1980 and washed down, notice the sediment layers in the lower picture. And within 5 years, they were hardening into rock. And that looks like a small image of the Grand Canyon. We have rapid sediment deposition. And again, Michael Ord in his book explains how only the flood model can give this, where you don't disrupt the sediment layers that have footprints and leaf marks and ripple marks. And we have examples. This is actually a dolphin, but the evolutionists give it another name, that it was buried instantaneously while it was giving birth and fossilized. And one last example here on this is when you have the sediment layers in the Grand Canyon, they are razor thin. There's no evidence of erosion or soil formation, and yet if they were formed millions of years apart, you should see all kind of pitting in them. We have examples of tree structures running through layers often found in coal mines between coal, shale, slate, sandstone layers. If they would have eroded long ago. Water gaps, again, Michael Ord describes how that worked. When the sediment layers were soft, they can fold and bend. Rock doesn't fold and bend. And so, I've given you 5 quick sweeps of defending creation. From defending Genesis, one is history, showing you that the fossils had to occur after Adam's sin. We looked at the evolutionary problems, and we've looked at the age of the earth and the flood. Quick views, right? Now, the problem is, you won't remember this. I see some of you taking notes, but we forget. That's why we have to study for exams. And how are we going to reinforce what Peter tells us, that we need to be ready and able to defend the faith we believe in? Well, that is why CMI publishes the material that we do, to help you make that defense. You can sign up for Info Bites, the table out there on each end of it. You can sign up for it. Every Friday, we send out quite interesting information. 1 week it's global to send out to all of our affiliate offices, and then the alternate weeks is local for Canada, and we do that. We have over 30,000 subscribers right now, and I'm hoping to add 1,000 out of my tour right now. So I'll sign up. We have a lot of subscribers. It's got always interesting articles, and all you need is an email address, and we'll start sending you our information. We have, this book is excellent. It's on basically in apologetics, why we're Christians, and it's really good if you want to discuss why we're not Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists, that kind of thing. And then we have our Creation Answers book, and you can get them as a companion. That answers 66 different questions. You don't have to read it cover to cover. You can just pick the topic you want. We have the Evolution's Achilles Heel, written by PhD scientists in their area of discipline, and an accompanying video. John Sephardi, who's got a doctorate in chemistry, and he is quite astute theologian. He's written this commentary. We have our Explorer Pack. I only have one left, and it's a huge bargain. And I'm going to pause here for 1 second before I talk about Creation Magazine. We do not make money selling this material. We price it so that we break even. We obviously have to charge because we have to ship it and manufacture it and all that. It's not a profit-making activity. So don't think that we are trying to keep the prices as low as we can possibly keep them so that you can get the information. Creation Magazine has been published for over 40 years. It is a rigorous editorial process in which it goes through, and I'm really proud of how these guys make sure that every word in there is very carefully vetted for accuracy. It's a family-oriented magazine. We have a technical journal called the Journal of Creation, but it is a family-oriented magazine, and if you're not subscribing to it in your family or get it for your grandchildren, you should be. And it is a tremendous resource, and these are examples of articles in it, and I have the sign-up sheets out there. And Jeff, you're ready to, it's Jeff, right? You're ready, he's there, he's going to show you how to fill in the forms. I'm not allowed to pass around the forms in this COVID situation. So if you rip off the bottom one, fill it in, and you have to make sure that you either give us a check or the credit card. We only bill you the quarter we're going to send you the article, or the issue, and if you sign up today, I'll give you a DVD and a free copy, which is basically getting 3 quarters for free. Now, the why we do this is people say, yeah, I'll sign up, and you have it on your website? Yes, we do. But then you go away and you forget. So we're trying to encourage people to sign up because it's probably the best resource that we have for $7.50 a quarter. It can be used as an evangelistic tool. In our congregation, Marianne and Ari Vandenberg, I went to high school with Marianne, actually, and her brother. He was a year ahead and she was a year behind. Marianne, in our congregation, Ari's father was 100 years old when he died about 6 or 9 months ago, and he was blind for probably a decade or more. And Marianne used to take Creation Magazine, and he would have his unbelieving children read it to him. And that's how he was introducing creation to them as an evangelism tool. One of my grandsons who lives in Quebec City, he's 13 years old, and he has a subscription to it, and he and his dad read it, and he always takes it to school with him to show his classmates. Pretty cool. You can put it in doctor's offices, real estate offices, wherever people sit and read magazines. And take it seriously. We get testimony after testimony coming into the magazine where people just serendipitously pick up the magazine. Of course, it's in God's providence, but serendipitously they pick up the magazine and they go, wow, and they are converted. We get testimonies like that. So it's a good resource. We have a children's pack. which you can give as gifts. The Creation Answers book for kids, DDV Explorer Back. You mentioned the Genesis Academy. You may be interested that we're coming out with a whole new curriculum that has 39 lessons in it. Could be used for homeschooling purposes and that kind of thing, or for the school. We were introduced to it in Wednesday. We have a Wednesday prayer meeting, and then we do some business items, and Matt introduced us to it, and it's coming out. So that's something you guys may want to look at, is the new curriculum. Because people would say, well, Answers in Genesis, how it's curriculum, why don't you? We do now. So, and if you don't want to spend a penny, our website's got to have the simplest name to remember, right? Creation.com. Not very difficult. We have 13,000 plus articles, and we're constantly publishing new ones. I just wrote an article, and it'll be published in the next few days. I just submitted it actually from my hotel room yesterday morning. It's on, and Robert Carter was my seconder, so he had reviewed it, but he didn't nerd it up. PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, made this statement that they want baseball to get rid of the bullpen because it's derogatory to animals. Like, talk about stupid. So I write on what the Bible gives us as the ethical treatment of animals, and then I analyze PETA's position. That's what I do in the article. So it'll be coming on the website. So if you look at the website, it'll be coming, and if you subscribe to InfoBytes, you'll get a mailing saying it's been published. So you might want to look for that if you're interested in that. And we're constantly adding to it. And also, some of you knew about this talk because you're not in this church. You knew about it from our calendars on that website. And it's all free. We also have Creation Magazine Live, and we're publishing the 9th season, or getting ready to put this 9th season. I should pause here. The editorial work for Creation Magazine and the Journal of Creation is done in Australia. The website is managed out of the United States. All the video work is done in Canada, in our studio in Kitchener. And these guys have put together an amazing studio. And we can produce all kinds of really high-quality video now. And the first 2 episodes that are coming on Season 9 are going to deal with global warming. And Richard asked me to write a script on the issue of death. I've also written a script that will be coming shortly this year on chimps and humans, based on a book that came out last month from ICR, Institute for Creation Research, showing how different the genomes are on chimps and humans. And he also asked me to put one together on the Ice Age. So those are potential episodes that are coming up. So, to conclude, internally in the church, we have people who are undermining six-day creation. These are evangelical. Many of them are good preachers. They're academics, but they're undermining it. We need to get our guns aligned and attack this evil of evolution. We need to be defending our faith and strengthening our young people, and that's the kind of material we have out there. Now, I've probably gone way over my time, but thank you for your patience. So we'll only have a short question and answer period because I went over my time. Would it be possible to get a bottle of water? A little dry. By the way, this is the 10th presentation I've done in 4 days. Wow. No, don't. It's just, thank you very much. So I'm a tad burned out. We can open it to questions. So you're going to have to speak fairly loud. You may have to pull your mask down so you're clear.
I'm baffled as to why it is so important for evolutionists to insist that the Earth is a tens of millions of years old. What is the purpose of that?
So I'm getting an echo here, so it's a little hard. Could somebody repeat it for me? So were they able to hear it on the streaming? Yeah, and it doesn't help that I wear hearing aids, so it makes it difficult. Huh?
You'll be able to hear from here.
Here, okay. Because if they don't insist on it, there's not enough time for evolution to occur. Because had to be millions and literally millions of changes in the genomes, and they don't see it, so the only answer is, if we have enough time, chance can do it. The primary reason for deep time is because evolution needs it. That's really it.
So my second question would be, why would Christians, knowing the genesis account and knowing that God is able to do whatever God wants to do, why do they want to reject these?
Because they want worldly academic credibility. They want to be viewed as having worldly academic credibility. That's really the answer.
They feel foolish if they believe the
Yeah.
creation.
Well, based on what you've seen here today, which I've only scratched the surface, you say, how could you believe in evolution, don't you? Yeah. But the simple reason is because declaring themselves wise, they became fools. Right? Romans 1:22. Any other questions?
Yes, I've just got a quick question here. I've discovered, and I guess it comes out of that biblical verse you put on the screen in regards to 1 Peter 3:15
Mm-hmm.
and 16. How do you get people to ask you questions then? Because
You mean unbelievers?
yes.
So I'm not going to teach a course on evangelism here. So I'm going to let your pastors answer that one, okay? Because there are all kinds of techniques, from friendship evangelism, using material from the Coral Ridge material, I forget what it was, Billy Graham Association had evangelism. There are all kinds of good material, but I'm not going to teach a course on evangelism, okay? But
I come from a church, it's a large church in Red Deer, and they will not have a creationist speaker come in. Why? It's too divisive, it's too political, and we probably have professionals leave the church with their money. What would you say?
well, let me turn it around. What would you say? No, I will answer too, but what would you say to that?
I'm ready to leave the church.
Because they're not willing to take the Word of God seriously, right? And the real, I believe it was Martin Luther that says, if you're not fighting the battle where Satan is pushing it, then you're fighting the wrong battle. Well, the battle right now that the church needs to be fighting is evolution. That's what we need to be fighting, because it is destroying young people and morality. Now, it's not the only causal factor, but it's a high causal factor for the chaos in our society, is 170 years of teaching evolution.
Last quick question. I used to work at Prairie here in the High Division, and I lead creation tours to the Terrell Museum. As we drove down into the Red River Valley, I would ask the question, what caused the river? Did the valley cause the river, or did the river cause the valley? Just to get them started.
Right, and it's the same thing I said about the Grand Canyon. Right.
You know, what question would you ask people that you found to be a very, very good question that really gets them thinking in regards to the whole creation evolution?
Well, it depends on where they're coming from, but creationists used to go on the tours of the Grand Canyon, and they would just sort of ask the guides, why is there no evidence of erosion in the strata? And the guides would get all flustered on that.
Good question.
So, but it depends. If you want to, why I'm dealing with the chimps and human genomes in the script I've written that'll eventually be on, is because Dawkins made this statement back in by 1986, and he said humans and chimps are 98.5% identical. And this has become widely accepted. Well, in fact, at the very, very best, the genomes overlap by about 84%. But there's a lot more problems, which
I go into, okay? So people get these sound bites. Dawkins said 98.5% identical, but it's not true. And that was in his book, I forget the title now, but which one?
God delusion?
No, it was a different one. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, any other? Yes, this young lady up here.
Thanks. When does that, the first 2 episodes about global warming come out? And is there a short soundbite you could give about why global warming isn't true? Just like a quick.
Okay, so I don't know. I know that, like on the call on Wednesday, Alexander said he was just finishing up some of the final editing. You know, after you do all the takes and everything, you'd have to put it all together. And he said, I don't know exactly the date it's going to be released. So my short answer on global warming is, yeah, there may have been global warming, but it's not caused by humans. Immediately after the flood, the Ice Age started. Literally, the winter after the flood. Now, I can go into the Ice Age if you want me to pursue that, but and it peaked after about 500 years, and then it started to decline. And the result of that is that the glaciers on North America melted away, and the glaciers continue to melt. And the Sahara Desert that used to be lush is now become desert, and so on. Yes, there's been global warming, but it's not human cause. It has nothing to do with, or tiny bit, with our burning carbon fuels. They might contribute this much, right? But, and to do things like carbon sequestering and carbon taxes and all that, it's absolutely absurd. And I can go into a lot more detail. Watch the episodes on global warming. But the very fact is, yes, there may have been some. But the warming was going on before the Industrial Revolution. Glaciers were melting away. It has nothing to do with automobiles and factories, right? But I can go into a lot more detail on, but you said just my brief opinion, right? The microphone, where's the microphone? Right there, sir.
Question about death.
About
Death. You referred to death,
Yeah.
right? Now, are you saying that death of any kind did not take place before the fall?
No. I'm saying death of creatures that God refers to as living creatures. It's a very
Okay, you're talking about biological creatures, right?
And he refers to animals of the field, as an example, as nefesh kaya,
Okay,
and man as nefesh
I
kaya.
understand that, right?
Right? But he doesn't use that term, for instance, when he creates plants. They're
No.
not called nefesh kaya.
Okay,
And so plants are essentially organic robots. That's essentially what they are.
okay, I understand that. What about animals for which death is a part of the natural cycle of their lives? I'm thinking of things like salmon. They go out to the sea for 2, 3, 4 years, then they come back, they mate, and lay eggs and die.
Yeah.
Right.
So if
And that
if
I
salmon-
take was
salmon-
true from the beginning.
If salmon are nefesh kaya, which I believe fish fall within that category,
Okay.
they would not have died before Adam's sin. Major changes occurred after Adam's sin. And I can get into some of the technical in terms of physics and things like that, and chemistry, which probably changed. But just one simple example. Animals were not carnivorous before Adam sinned, because God gave plants to animals and humans. And so carnivorism, which is natural now, was not natural in the Garden of Eden. And so what we refer to as natural now, like
the salmon cycle was not part of the original creation.
You
God
had-
has a purpose for it now, but it wasn't natural in the Garden of Eden or in the post-fall world. Now, don't get too hung up on this, because remember, it wasn't years and years between the time Adam was created and he fell. In fact, I can argue that it was probably within a week.
That's a topic for discussion.
Right. Well, and
I
I'll just give you
happen to
one
be-
thing to think about, because Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply. Just think about that. Now, if Eve had become pregnant before Adam sinned, we've got a theological problem, because we have a creature that was conceived before in a sinless state. Only Christ is conceived sinless. So theologically, we have a problem if it was a long period of time. So just think about that one. Anyway.
Here's a question.
Can we end in about at the top of the hour?
Here's a question here.
Huh? So we'll take a few more questions and we'll end at the top of the hour. Is that all right? Because we're starting to actually lose people here, and probably lose me, and I'm going to collapse.
Am I good?
Okay, go ahead.
You say that creation is a foundational doctrine.
Yes.
Does that mean that Christians can't believe in anything else than a 6,000-year-old creation account?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
You said that creationism is a foundational
Right.
doctrine. Does that mean then Christians who believe in anything other than a 6,000-year-old creation aren't Christians?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. I think they're mistaken, but I would never say that they're not Christians. I wish they would come to our position, but no. Think about it. Christians have all kinds of differences of opinions in all kinds of areas. So I would say if they believe in the core doctrines, like we call them the Chalcedonian Creed type of doctrines, they are Christians. I think it's sad that they won't accept the Genesis 1 account. But I can tell you this, that every time they take this view, there seems to be this drift into other false doctrines. As soon as they reject Genesis 1 as a history, and Genesis 1 to 11 is history, they start to introduce other false doctrines. It seems to influence them. Doesn't mean that they're not Christians. No, I would definitely not. But it's a good... Yes?
We run into a lot of people, at least I do, who say, well, it doesn't really matter what you think about Genesis as long as you've got the gospel straight. And so they don't really even want to consider it. I think they've been listening to Hugh Ross. I'm not sure.
So that particular argument, as long as we believe, there's no reason, right, to worry about, is that what people are saying? Yeah. So we have addressed that particular claim multiple times on our website, because we constantly get people sending in questions and those kinds of things. So I would refer you to our website and just look for those kinds of articles, because Lita Kostner wrote on those multiple times. I know Jonathan Sephardi's written on it. It's a constant. Sean Doyle has written on it. Constantly we get this. That, well, as long as I'm a Christian, what difference does it make of whether I believe God used evolution or not, right? So we've given many examples of why it's a problem. It doesn't mean they're not Christians. It's just a problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just,
Didn't you already get a chance to ask questions?
I did. I asked 3, and I just have one more, 4.
One. Okay.
And this is a personal one for you. Me personally, I've found that the creation movement, which I've been a part of for 40 years, has really deepened my faith. And I find a lot of people in the Christian circles have something terrible happen to them, and all of a sudden they're gone. How has the creation movement and the fact that God is creator, designer, deepened your faith in your life?
Well, that's a real personal question, isn't it? How has it deepened my faith?
So I can't separate the creation doctrine from my belief in the scriptures. Like, I believe wholeheartedly the whole scriptures are the Word of God, and that's what I base as my foundation that God said. So I can't just say it in creation, but I can say, everything from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, right? That was what deepens my faith. So just in my own personal history, when I was in high school, a friend of mine at our Christian fellowship invited me to attend a lecture. Now, he was a Christian, and he invited me to attend a lecture at his church. That church is no longer gone. Condos are there where that building was. And a man speaking there, and I'm sure you've heard the name, was Whitcomb. And they brought book table, and one of the books was written by Morrison Whitcomb. You know the book? The Genesis Flood. And that was a seminal work that basically kicked off this whole, let's get serious about science. And Morris was a geologist, and he dealt with the flood. Now, a lot of what he wrote is quite dated, and our scientists have really given a lot better explanations, but it was important, and from that moment in high school, I have been fascinated with this subject, and I've read and written, and so that's my personal journey. Okay, well, we have time. Oh, it's not the top of the hour. I was looking at the wrong thing here. We could be here for hours. I read my watch upside down. Maybe 2 more questions, if there are. Well, Pastor, do you want to close?
You go ahead, John. Go ahead.
I was just the introducer. That's good. Okay, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the wonderful fact that you created with an end in mind, purpose in mind, which includes everyone attending in this room and all the people that we represent. May the truth of the Scriptures convince us. We may have questions about many aspects, but we pray that the truth of the Scriptures will come clearly to our hearts wherever it really needs to touch us, and help everything that was said tonight to bring profit and not the opposite. We pray that you'll just help us to go forth thinking and seeking your word for further revelation, we pray. Bless our brother here as he goes on to speaking tour. Give him his full strength of voice and good health, and take him back to Ontario for your blessing in that organization. We pray that you'll bless Creation Ministries International and all their connections with other creationist organizations and churches, and just guide in our world that in many of these issues, sense will prevail among those who know the Scriptures. We pray and commit this to you now in Jesus' name. Amen.